Hello friends. In this week's video we will be discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis. There may be several of my viewers who are old enough to have lived through this moment. This is an interesting subject to me, as now there are many more former KGB and Cuban sources that provide the information that was not available for many years. My particular source contained much of that info, and I'm providing a link in the description if you want to check it out. So Cuba was one of the last imperial colonies to shake off colonial rule. When they were a Spanish colony, they attempted to rebel against Spain in 1868 and again in 1879. Both rebellions were failures. But in 1895, they mounted a successful rebellion with the help of the United States. The U.S. had a long history of trying to prevent European interference in Latin America, which goes back to James Monroe's Monroe Doctrine, which states that foreign interference would be treated as an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. Thomas Jefferson had even suggested at one time making Cuba a U.S. state. By 1902, Spain had withdrawn and renounced their claims to Cuba. Independence had been declared. The U.S. government had worked out agreements that actually limited Cuban sovereignty. The U.S. government had the right to have military bases on the island and intervene in the internal affairs for the sake of stability. This made Cuba essentially an American colony. The U.S. did what they could to establish alliances with wealthy landowners and military generals, and most assets and economic interests were controlled by the U.S. Also, gambling interests became thriving industries, controlled mostly by the American mafia. General Fulgencio Batista, who was the U.S.'s greatest ally, was corrupt as a ruler, acting as a dictator. Young revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro attempted an attack in 1953 that failed. After being imprisoned for 2 years, they were released as Batista attempted to improve his image internationally. Eventually, Castro, with the help of many other revolutionaries, including Che Guevara, attempted a revolt. Batista responded by brutal tactics against the revolutionaries, which only increased the numbers of them. The U.S. responded by imposing a trade embargo against the Batista government. So part of the embargo included a sale of weapons, which actually ended up giving the revolutionaries the upper hand, and then Batista was forced to flee the country. Castro and Guevara conducted purges against their enemies, consolidating their power. At first it was unclear on what kind of relationship the U.S. would have with Castro, but in May of 1959 Castro confiscated land without compensation to the landowners, nationalized all businesses and properties. U.S. President Eisenhower responded by closing American markets to Cuban sugar. By February of 1960, one of Nikita Khrushchev's advisors visited Cuba. This led to a suggestion to Khrushchev to provide economic assistance to Cuba. By May of the same year, Khrushchev threatened the U.S. with nuclear arms over Cuban independence. Essentially, the Soviet Union had enforced their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. This is where a push began within the Eisenhower administration to try to attempt a coup using political exiles returning to Cuba. The CIA developed a plan, but it couldn't be carried out with so little time left in the Eisenhower presidency. The plan was inherited by John F. Kennedy when he became president. The plan was presented to JFK on January 28, 1961, 1 week after he became president. The plan was to land hundreds of guerrilla fighters recruited from Cuban exiles and trained in CIA camps in Guatemala. The fighters would establish a beachhead and airstrip that would serve as a base to land future troops. The thought, too, was the popular uprising could happen to potentially oust Castro's regime. Some within JFK's administration immediately suggested concerns with the plan. The force that was ready to fight numbered 6,000 to 8,000 men. They thought that this wouldn't be enough because Castro had recently built his military up. There was also concern that other Latin American countries would view the U.S. in a negative light. So Kennedy's advisors took another look at the possibilities for the invasion. Kennedy did not want communism spread in the Western Hemisphere, but wanted to keep relationships with the rest of Latin America. He also wanted to not upset Soviet relations further. Kennedy suggested infiltrating in small groups within Cuba and not anything front-facing like the original Eisenhower administration's idea. But the CIA still pushed in the other direction, rejecting JFK's idea because they indicated that guerrilla groups needed air support and tank cover. JFK still relented and looked for a compromise with the CIA. There would be air support, but the planes needed to at least appear to be Cuban and did not want to have the appearance of being American planes. To make this possible, a Cuban airstrip would have to be procured to support the claim that the force was Cuban. The other goal was for the captured land to be defensible. Kennedy approved the plan, but indicated that the operation needed to be conducted overnight, with the ship bringing the task force leaving by dawn. So the ship left Nicaragua on April 14, 1961. On April 15th, 8 B-26 bombers painted in Cuban markings and piloted by Cuban exiles left Nicaragua and flew to Cuban airfields to destroy the Cuban Air Force before they left the ground. The raid on the airfields did somewhat succeed, but Castro then went to the UN and claimed that this was a prelude to a U.S. invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy had told UN Representative Adlai Stevenson previously that there would be no U.S. involvement in Cuba. Stevenson told the UN that Cuba's revolutionaries had performed the raid, even producing a particular photograph that showed a Cuban plane that landed in Miami, which in reality was part of the CIA operation. So the ships were still in the water and planes were in the air. All that was left was JFK's approval for the final go-ahead for the invasion. He had until Sunday, April the 16th in order to make that particular decision. But then it started falling apart that day. Some newspapers exposed the plane in Miami as being CIA window dressing. The B-26 plane was different than the ones that Cubans used, and the gun on the plane in Miami had not been fired. This made Kennedy hesitant to sign off, but then at 1:45 he indicated to the CIA to go ahead with the invasion. So the landing began on multiple locations in Cuba. Early in the morning, April 17th, the ships approached the Bay of Pigs. There were no military units around, so the exiles were able to overwhelm the locals. But before the brigade could accomplish its goal, news of the invasion was broadcasted to Castro, who took his remaining planes and sent them to the Bay of Pigs. But because the aircraft Castro had outnumbered the CIA's planes, they were at a disadvantage. The ships USS Houston and the USS Rio Escondido that were carrying fuel and ammunition were destroyed. The other transport ships were prevented from getting to the beaches by the reefs, and the transfers using the smaller boats weren't successful. Much of the ammunition and weapons were lost in the high water and damaged. Castro's reinforcements, numbering 20,000, arrived, and also some Soviet T-34 tanks. The CIA, knowing now that they were at a disadvantage, asked JFK for U.S. air support, but he refused. The State Department was angry that the CIA had withheld info about the Miami plane, putting them in a position to lie to the United Nations. The State Department now tried to kill CIA plans for any more airstrikes, which Kennedy did not override that attempt. The invaders had to fight for their lives without any other support. But as things got worse for them, on April 19th, Kennedy allowed camouflage planes to support the invaders. He indicated they could only go on short missions and were not allowed to engage enemy aircraft. The planes arrived late and 2 of them were shot down, and 4 pilots went missing. JFK refused any other support of the operations, and the invaders surrendered. 100 had died, with 360 wounded and another 1,200 imprisoned in Cuba. It was an embarrassment for JFK. Several in the CIA had to resign, essentially taking the fall for the failure. The military, CIA, and JFK's administration essentially blamed each other for the failure. Nikita Khrushchev, for his part, seized the opportunity. He saw Kennedy as weak compared to Eisenhower. He called a summit for June 3, 1961 in Vienna. Khrushchev wanted to use the opportunity to discuss West Berlin and possible nuclear disarmament. Kennedy agreed, knowing that due to the Bay of Pigs debacle, he needed to appear willing to negotiate. But right away it went very icy. Khrushchev suggested the U.S. leave Berlin. Previously, Khrushchev had threatened to seize control of access routes to West Berlin if the U.S., France, and British did not withdraw. Khrushchev at the summit stated that the future belonged to communism. Kennedy made the statement that it would be a mistake for both countries to miscalculate the other. The next day, Khrushchev pushed to reunite Berlin under East German rule. Khrushchev said he would guarantee that the USSR could no longer interfere in Germany if the agreement could be made. Kennedy refused, indicating such a move would isolate the U.S. Khrushchev was infuriated and indicated that he would sign a treaty giving East Germany access rights to West Berlin. The back and forth escalation continued, with Khrushchev saying, "If there is a madman who wants war, he should be put in a straitjacket." JFK took that as a threat. Kennedy finally ended the discussion by saying it will be a cold winter. JFK returned to the U.S. feeling defeated. He felt the ill treatment by Khrushchev came back to the Bay of Pigs invasion. Khrushchev told his advisors of JFK, "This man is very inexperienced, even immature. Compared to him, Eisenhower was a man of intelligence and vision." Later, on June 15th, Khrushchev attacked what he called the capitalist monopolists for their stall of negotiations, even stating the Cold War is a period of preparation, accumulating forces for war. Kennedy was concerned his military advisors had told him that losses in a nuclear war could be up to 70 million, or roughly 30 to 40% of the population at that time. JFK needed something to change perception of him being weak. On July 25th, JFK gave a speech stating Congress had authorized more than $12 billion for new aircraft, missiles, and ships. Also, he called for new defense spending and a larger military force for the Army and Navy. His statement was very direct. "We do not want to fight, but we have fought before, and others in earlier times have made the same dangerous mistake of assuring the West was too weak and too soft and too divided to resist invasions of freedom in other lands. Those who threaten to unleash the forces of war on a dispute over West Berlin should recall the words of the ancient philosopher, 'A man who causes fear cannot be free from fear.'" Khrushchev called JFK's speech a preliminary declaration of war. He threatened to sign his treaty with East Germany and threatened nuclear action. Khrushchev's hands were somewhat tied. He could not get additional funding to build his military up further. East Germans continued to cross west, which at that time was not a challenge. 130,000 had done so in the first 7 months of 1961. This is when the East German leader Walter Ulbricht decided to present the idea of the Berlin Wall. Khrushchev kicked around the idea most of that summer, and by August 1st he authorized Ulbricht to build the wall. JFK reacted with complete shock. None of his spies and foreign operatives had seen this coming. JFK reacted by sending 1,500 troops marching into West Berlin from West Germany, using the only access highway from West Germany to affirm U.S. access rights and reassure West Berliners. JFK had another problem. General Lucius Clay sent U.S. tanks to Checkpoint Charlie, which caused the Soviets to do the same. This standoff was tense, but eventually both sets of tanks backed up due to orders from the White House and the Kremlin. Fidel Castro had declared shortly after this time that he was both a Marxist and a Leninist. The reaction in the U.S. was a bit of, there you go, as many made that supposition previously. Khrushchev was less than pleased. As he later wrote in his memoir, "We had trouble understanding the timing of that statement. Castro's declaration had the immediate effect of widening the gap between himself and the people who were against socialism, and it narrowed the circle of those that he could count on for support against the invasion. As far as Castro's personal courage was concerned, his position was admirable and correct, but from a tactical standpoint, it did not make much sense. But it did likely make sense from the standpoint of putting Khrushchev in a position to stand up to the U.S. on Cuba's behalf. 1962 was a bad year economically for Cuba. New sanctions were put into place which applied to Cuban sugar and cigars. Soviet and Chinese demand for these products did not compare to that which existed in the U.S. Rationing of goods began. This brought a sense of urgency to Castro's situation, and he kept pushing the Soviets for more support. And then there was the threat of another U.S. military invasion. By April 1962, Moscow sent missiles to Castro, and some Ilyushin 28 medium bombers and R-15 cruise missile launchers. In addition, Khrushchev wrote off all previous debt that Cuba had to the Soviet Union. These things made Castro feel warm and fuzzy towards Khrushchev and cemented their alliance. After the Soviets had exploded a hydrogen bomb above the Arctic, JFK resumed his nuclear testing as well, exploding one on Christmas Island in the Pacific in April of 1962. There was also work on solid fuel rockets in the U.S. capable of long-range destruction. JFK had made statements indicating that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons in case of an attack on Western Europe. Khrushchev fired back that such a move would be suicide, but Khrushchev knew that he had nothing long-range capable of reaching the U.S. using rocket technology. This is the point where Khrushchev began the conversation of deployment of missiles to his ally, Cuba. Khrushchev indicated at the time his reasoning: they will be put in the same balance of forces as with our country. Any aggression against Cuba will mean a strike on American territory. They will have to give up any plans of an invasion of Cuba. Khrushchev's plan went as follows: install nuclear weapons, transport them secretly, disclose them later, keep the rockets under Soviet guidance. One of Khrushchev's cabinet, Anastas Mikoyan, had his concerns about this plan. I told him what I saw in Cuba with my own eyes in 1960. No woods to hide missile launchers, just some palm trees too far away from each other. The palm trees were in fact naked trees with leaves only on top. I told them that the consequences could be dangerous and even catastrophic. The Americans could launch a strike on our missiles and destroy them in several minutes. What will we do then? Just swallow that, look disgraced in front of the entire world, and possibly lose Cuba? Or retaliate with a nuclear strike, which would mean the initiation of the war? Khrushchev doubled down. The price of a military venture against Cuba must be raised to the maximum, and in some measure the threat to Cuba must be made comparable to the threat to the United States. Only the installation of our rockets with nuclear warheads can be such a means. Americans have already surrounded the Soviet Union with a ring of their military bases and multi-purpose missile installations. We should pay them back and give them a taste of their own medicine. Castro had been informed of the idea and agreed, saying, if this will strengthen the socialist camp and contribute to the defense of Cuba, we are willing to accept all the missiles, even 1,000, if you want to send us so many. Raul Castro was concerned about the secrecy of the operation, though, and in a conversation with Castro asked, "What precautions have you taken in case the operation is discovered by the U.S. before it was made public?" Khrushchev responded rather uncouthly and said, "Don't worry, I'll grab Kennedy by the balls and make him negotiate." That summer, Khrushchev put his plan into play, which included two missile types, the R-12 Dvina and the R-12 Churyusova, would be placed into Cuba. Khrushchev indicated later another part of the plan, which included military force deployments. "We considered if we were to indeed place rockets, then they had to be protected and defended." The soldiers and nuclear experts were covertly sent in different attachments. The planes would be funneled through the African nation of Guinea, who was a Soviet ally. One of the planes headed to Havana had soldiers with documentation indicating that they were agriculturalists. Between Guinea and Havana, there were several stopovers and plane changes, and due to a tropical storm, a forced emergency landing had to be made in Nassau in the Bahamas. As the soldiers left the plane in Nassau, they were instantly spotted by American tourists who were curious about these Russians. Little did they know they were seeing Soviet nuclear specialists, but there was no breach of cover, and the Soviets continued on to Havana from there. In Cuba, they began scouting locations for missiles. They determined, like Anastas McCoy said before, that there was no easy place to conceal missiles. They then decided on a phased approach. They would install anti-aircraft weaponry capable of destroying American U-2 spy planes. The hope was if a spy plane got near the missiles, the anti-aircraft weaponry could take the spy plane out before they saw the missiles. By September, all the defense weaponry and the missiles were in place. In the meantime, additional deployments were being transported of soldiers by sea. Once Soviet ships got to the Atlantic, they spotted American airplanes flying over their vessels. More flyovers happened the closer they got to Cuba. On August 31st, the CIA informed JFK that they had spotted surface-to-air missiles. These weren't the nuclear ones, just ones capable of shooting down U-2 spy planes. JFK's Republican opponents, upon this news, accused the president of being weak on foreign policy and putting the country in danger. Kenneth Keating, a New York Republican senator, pointed out the threat to Congress. More than 20 cargo ships had arrived from communist ports in the last few weeks. Many have been unloaded under maximum security. Between 3,000 and 5,000 so-called technicians have arrived. Time is short. The situation is growing worse. I urge upon my government that prompt action be taken. At this point, there was still no knowledge of the nuclear capabilities present. JFK continued to strategize, but still at the forefront was the Berlin issue. Khrushchev had been using Berlin as a bit of a negotiating smokescreen to distract JFK from what was going on in Cuba. Khrushchev said, "Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin." As for Cuba, JFK had placed his brother Robert in charge of dealing with that issue. He had been comforted by the understanding that the Cuban military capability was defensive. It was thought to be unlikely for Cuba to have any capability of major concern. The second week of August, the New York Times reported that 4,000 Soviet soldiers arrived in July. Once this became knowledge, some in JFK's administration began discussing options of a blockade, but there was concern that it could have international repercussions. The Berlin issue was in their mind. If they were trying a blockade or military action, Berlin could be in danger. Khrushchev had JFK spooked on Berlin. Khrushchev met with Fidel Castro's emissary, Che Guevara. They had talked about a more public defense treaty, but Khrushchev refused, indicating that if the Americans had discovered the nuclear missiles, the Baltic Fleet would be sent to Cuba. Publicly, Khrushchev began escalating talk of protecting Cuba. "If you attack Cuba, that would create a situation. You have surrounded us with military bases. If you attack Cuba, then we will attack some of the countries where you have placed your bases." He was referring specifically to Turkey and Europe. By September, Kennedy made the decision to call up 150,000 Army reservists. Khrushchev heard of this and was unnerved and responded by saying, Our nuclear weapons are so potent in their explosive force and the rockets to carry the nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites beyond the Soviet Union. He further predicted that any attack on Cuba could lead to a universal world war with nuclear weapons. John McCone, the head of the CIA, was the first to raise the suspicion that perhaps the Soviets had nuclear capability on Cuba. It was more of a supposition. The thinking was that they would not need surface-to-air missile installations in Cuba, if not for the need to protect something more potent. He suggested more frequent flyovers of spy planes over Cuba. The Department of State did not like this spy plane mission idea, concerned that they would provoke Cuba and the Soviets. The Berlin issue was at the forefront, and they didn't want to set those negotiations back. Essentially, Khrushchev had time to deploy the nukes undetected. The CIA had thought that there were 4,000 Soviet troops in Cuba. The reality was, between July and October of 1961, 40,000 Soviet troops were deployed to Cuba. By mid-September, the missiles had been unloaded in secret at night, and by the end of the month, they were at their designated locations in Cuba. By mid-October, the missiles would be ready to be fired within 10 hours of notice. Before that, then, John McCone, the CIA chief, received a report that a Soviet R-12 nuclear missile had been seen on a Cuban road earlier that month. Cuban refugees had also reported that troop movements were being done in secret throughout Cuba. So on October 9th, John McCone met with JFK and his cabinet. He wanted to confirm the missile presence by sending spy planes. JFK agreed. Major Richard Heiser entered Cuban airspace on October 14th. The pictures that his U-2 plane took confirmed that there were indeed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy had another problem as well. It was midterm election time, and he was being criticized by the Republicans, who asserted that the missiles were present. By this time, even though the Republicans were making suppositions about the missiles, JFK now had hard photographic evidence of it. JFK felt betrayed by Khrushchev. "He can't do this to me," he said. JFK told his brother Robert that Khrushchev is an immoral gangster and a liar. Kennedy now felt Cuba had to be on the forefront of his policy. In meeting with his cabinet, JFK was trying to decide if he should send a strike team to wipe the threat out or build up a situation where Russia or Cuba had to act. It was a diplomacy or military action decision. Kennedy at first was leaning towards the surgical strike solution, but the State Department and Department of Defense were against it. They didn't believe the strike would be effective and would only put the Soviets on alert. JFK was in a bind politically and had been seen as weak on the Soviet Union. He delayed the decision, though, as he could get no consensus from his advisors. But unbeknownst to JFK or any of his advisors, the missiles were combat ready already, even capable of reaching Washington, D.C. A surgical strike would have likely led to all-out nuclear war. Moscow had already transferred authorization to Soviet commanders in Cuba upon attack. Luckily for JFK and the world, Kennedy had decided to pause. As Kennedy's deliberations went on, the fear of losing Berlin did give him some hesitancy. If he grabs Berlin, everyone would feel that we lost Berlin because of these missiles. The question really is to what degree that we take lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure, and at the same time maintain some degree of solidarity with our allies. John McCone made an attempt at this point to draw JFK back from going the covert military action route. He didn't want the U.S. to act without warning, thus looking like Japan when they attacked Pearl Harbor. He urged JFK to let the Soviets know that they were aware of these missiles. JFK would not agree to this and decided to remain silent even when he met with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. So the conversation when Gromyko came about with neither letting on the cards that they had to play. Gromyko indicated they would escalate Berlin after the midterm elections. Gromyko on Cuba mentioned having defensive weapons and acted incredulous as to why Kennedy would have any objections to Cuba wanting to defend itself. By the end of that day, JFK restarted the discussion with his cabinet, and he began discussing the possibility of a naval blockade in lieu of a strike. On October 19th, JFK met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The mood of the room was a bit hawkish, to say the least. The Joint Chiefs wanted to go into Cuba on a full-on invasion, but JFK was still examining all options. If we attack Cuba or the missiles, it gives them a clear line to take Berlin, which leaves me the only alternative to fire nuclear weapons, a hell of an alternative. He was still deliberating on the blockade as well, but was concerned that Berlin could once again be isolated in a blockade by the Soviets. The Joint Chiefs could sense that JFK didn't want the invasion option, so they switched tactics and started pushing the surgical strike idea, thinking that could lead to an invasion. General Curtis LeMay remarked, "I do not share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they are going to knock off Berlin. If we do nothing, they are going to push on Berlin and push real hard because they've got us on the run." LeMay even attacked the legacy of his father, Joseph Kennedy, by remarking about the appeasement of Munich, which was seen as a failure diplomatically for Joseph Kennedy on the eve of World War II. Kennedy felt LeMay's attack on his father was very personal and left the meeting feeling very frustrated and accomplished nothing other than leaving JFK's two options of the strike or blockade as the same as they were before the meeting started. JFK's brother Robert was surprisingly one of the ones who tried to rush JFK towards military action, at least privately to his brother. But as it became apparent that JFK was leaning towards the blockade, Robert fully supported it. Then on October 22nd, JFK called Dwight Eisenhower to get his opinion. He supported the blockade option, but believed ultimately that they would have to invade. So at 7 p.m. that evening, JFK addressed the nation. Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. JFK then indicated that a missile fired from Cuba would be met with full retaliation on the Soviets. He then announced 7 steps, which included the quarantine on all offensive military equipment being shipped to Cuba. He indicated they would not deny any necessities of life to the Cuban people. He then stated that Khrushchev needed to withdraw what he called clandestine, reckless, and provocative threats to world peace. Prior to this, as murmurs indicated to Khrushchev, JFK's address was coming. The Soviets put their commanders in Cuba on full alert. They had prepared for the worst, but stopped short of authorizing a full nuclear option, but did authorize the use of retaliation in case of an attack. Prior to his address, a letter from JFK had been delivered through the Soviet ambassador to Khrushchev. The letter, while expressing the frustration of the security threat, ended with a call for a dialogue. I hope that your government will refrain from any action which would widen or deepen the already grave crisis, and that we can agree to resume the path of peaceful negotiations. Upon getting the information, Khrushchev was happy because he was anticipating military or nuclear action. He had all ships with weapons to Cuba turned back to Soviet ports for the moment, but wanted to withhold the information from the USA for the time being. But Soviet nuclear submarines were ordered to continue to Cuba as planned. Nuclear weapons, too, would remain in Cuba, blockade or not. Now the particulars of the blockade had to be worked out. A letter was sent to Khrushchev urging him to observe the terms of the blockade. Khrushchev issued an order for many of the ships to turn back, but the ones already close he ordered to proceed. Other than flyovers, little was actually done by the blockade to impede the passage of the ships that were close. One of the ships, the Alexandrovsk, carried nuclear warheads. One order JFK issued to stop all ships was withdrawn after seeing some of the Soviet ships turn around. Once the blockade commenced, however, Khrushchev had become more agitated and was reportedly lashing out publicly. William Knox, president of Westinghouse Corporation, had a conversation with Khrushchev in which Khrushchev made a rather strong statement. The Soviet Union had anti-aircraft missiles in Cuba as well as ballistic missiles with both conventional and nuclear warheads. The missiles were 100% under Soviet control and could only be fired in defense of Cuba and upon my personal orders. If the Americans do not believe that, they could try to attack Cuba. If the United States wants to start a war, we'll all meet in hell. Khrushchev had received news also that the Alexandrovsk had reached Cuba with warheads. It emboldened him further and sent a letter to Kennedy referring to his blockade as illegal and calling it an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of a nuclear missile war. On October 24th, Kennedy upgraded the alert readiness to DEFCON 2, which is just short of a war status, the highest level ever to that time. Thousands of bombers, ballistic missiles with warheads were ready to strike targets in the Soviet Union. The Soviets caught wind of this, and Khrushchev was convinced JFK was ready to attack Moscow. Time for an about face, and this was Khrushchev's response in a letter. We have now made Cuba a focus of world attention. We have knocked two systems head to head. Kennedy says to us, take your missiles out of Cuba. We answer, give us firm guarantees and promises that you will not attack Cuba. We could take out our R-12 missiles and leave other missiles there. Fighting is not to our advantage. The future does not depend on Cuba, but our country. As for the ship, the Alexandrovsk, which had nuclear warheads, it was told to reload them and return to the Soviet Union. On October 25th, the Soviets suffered another setback when Adlai Stevenson presented proof of nuclear missiles to the UN. This kept the Soviets from having any further plausible deniability as to their existence. At this point, Khrushchev sent a follow-up letter to JFK with the following particulars. The Soviet Union would remove weaponry from Cuba that the U.S. deems offensive. The U.S. is to remove offensive weaponry in Turkey. Mutual signing of the Test Ban Treaty. This was a problem for JFK as he had received Khrushchev's previous letter that did not mention Turkey. JFK was concerned because to most of the world the Soviet proposal would seem reasonable. Kennedy was told by his advisors, though, that the NATO allies would feel abandoned by such a move. So planned for October 28th or 29th was an airstrike followed by an invasion. JFK could not accept the Soviet terms, even though JFK wanted to accept their proposal. He did not want to override what he thought he could pull off politically. And then came a curveball. Kennedy was notified that a U-2 spy plane over the North Pole had gone off course and had gone into Soviet airspace, which could mean war with the Soviet Union. Even though no dogfights in the air took place and the pilot returned safely, it put a huge problem in JFK's path. JFK had also received word that Cuba began shooting at reconnaissance planes. This gave him some impetus to try to move to resolution of this issue. As it turned out, one of the U-2 planes had been hit by Soviet fire. This pushed even more urgency into the situation. JFK had every right, since the Soviets had fired first, to make the next move. So JFK decided to make one last gambit. He proposed that the missiles would be withdrawn from Turkey in 4 to 5 months, but would have to be done in secret. When Khrushchev received the offer, he took it to the party presidium, who were kind of an elected cabinet that Khrushchev needed to get approval from. Seeing the urgency of the situation, they approved. Khrushchev drafted a letter to Kennedy, and while accepting his terms, took shots for the violation that the plane made into Soviet airspace. Kennedy was able to be seen in a positive light after the letter from Khrushchev was received, although the Turkish missile sites were something he would have to deal with. Khrushchev declared himself the victor. He pointed out that he saved Cuba. I am of the opinion that we won. One must start from the final aims that we set ourselves. What aim did the Americans have? To attack Cuba and get rid of the Cuban Republic, to establish a reactionary regime in Cuba. Our main aim was to save Cuba. We achieved our objective. We wrenched the promise out of the Americans that they would not attack Cuba. This was actually some of the sentiment worldwide, but mainly in the corner of Soviet allies. But there were others that were just grateful to Khrushchev for backing down. But in the U.S. and among its allies, it was JFK who was seen as the winner. But JFK was looking at it as a New York Times article asserted, an honorable accommodation in a single isolated area of the Cold War. Fidel Castro felt, on the other hand, betrayed as he saw Cuba as being used as a bargaining chip. He reportedly hurled a string of expletives as he smashed a mirror in his home. Later, Castro affirmed concessions on the part of the Soviet Union produced a sense of oppressiveness. Psychologically, our people were not prepared for that, as if we were deprived not only of the missiles but of the very symbol of solidarity. Castro essentially was refusing to sanction the deal and would not comply with Union inspectors of missile sites, but the Soviets did what they could to make the agreement work, even agreeing to have the ships inspected by UN officials. The last ship carrying the nuclear R-12 missiles left Cuba on November the 9th. The rest of the forces left in mid-December. Soviet ships during this time had to be inspected as they were leaving. One of Khrushchev's advisors later said of this, "Neither the Russian nor the Soviet army ever suffered such humiliation as to allow the adversary to inspect weapons transports." But Khrushchev did accomplish one thing, saving Cuba from an invasion, thus keeping it communist, also having the missile sites in Turkey removed. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963 prior to JFK's assassination. I'm going to leave you with this quote. It's a quote by the author of my source. It explains the legacy that Khrushchev and Kennedy left by not escalating further. The author indicates that the success of the outcome of the Cuban crisis saved the world not just once but twice. With the signing of the partial nuclear test ban treaty, Kennedy and Khrushchev saved the world a second time by drastically limiting radioactive fallout, which threatened life on this planet as we know it. If humanity is lucky enough to survive the new nuclear age and live for another 30 to 40 million years, geologists studying ice cores, corals, and rocks will still be able to pinpoint the time when the Kennedy-Khrushchev treaty was signed. Earth scientists suggested that a series of nuclear explosions that shook the planet in the 1950s and 1960s caused a golden spike period, a geological marker created by an event of global proportions that indicates the start of a new age in the world's history. I appreciate your attention. Thank you for watching and see you next time.